10 million pesos on the table. 30 days on the clock. The announcement hit the plaza like a thunderclap. The mayor leaned on the microphone and said the numbers as if he were reading a verdict. The offer was blunt and public, an ultimatum dressed as charity. A poor girl named Anna felt the clink of imagined coins in the pocket of her worn dress, as if the sound could someday become real. She was 12, small hands calloused from carrying water, hair usually tied back under a faded cobija, and she had an urgency in her chest that smelled of iron and fever. The horse in the owner Don Miguel's hacienda was a problem with teeth and noise and a name people refused to say aloud. Trainers had walked away with bloody sleeves. Pedro the vaquero called it a monster that reared with a relincho like a storm and left cicatrices on 5 men. The beast had weight in the story, not only in kilograms, and neighbors still carried the memory of Costco's striking wood. Anna listened to the anuncio and to the rustle of market cloths, to the breath of the crowd that smelled of bon and sweat, and she heard, underneath everything, the thin, precise sound of a mother counting coins into una lata at night. She looked at Maria, her mother, whose hands trembled when she tied knots, whose cough sometimes filled the hut like rain through a cracked roof. The money was for Maria's surgery, the single thing that might stop the slow steal of her health. When Anna stood up and said quietly, "Let me try," people laughed. When she said, "I will not break him, I will calm him," the laughter thinned into a kind of suspense. No one expected what would come next. Anna's backstory fit into the feel of old photographs and tin plates. Her father had died in the fields when she was 6, a snapped axle and a day of rain that left their small house full of silence. Maria, her mother, sewed in the dark by the glow of an oil lamp, her fingers moving with the memory of a better harvest. Rosa, the abuela, kept the old songs and a small box of remedies that smelled of eucalyptus and cinnamon. Together, they saved coins in a dented lata under a floorboard, each coin like a pebble against a dam. Anna had learned, from hunger and from lack, to measure everything: the exact yield of a patch of corn, the time it took for the river to change its smell, the different rhythms of a dog that was resting and a dog that was ready to run. She had learned to read the world by touch and by breath. She could tell when the air before the rain felt thick, when a horse's crine trembled, when a man's step was not quite steady. Once, as a child, she had pressed her small palm to a donkey's flank and felt a heat like an ember, and the donkey had answered with an eye that closed like a door. That memory lived in her when she agreed to the contracto that would bind her to 30 days and a horse that every trainer declared untouchable and savage. The backstory was not a single paragraph. It was the house with a hole in the roof, the cobija that smelled of lavender, the abuela's lullaby about a woman who could speak to animals. It was the way her fingers curled around coins and the decision that money could not be everything, because sometimes the thing you needed was to restore confianza in someone who had been hurt. Don Miguel had owned the horse the community called El Tormento since the animal was a cult. He was a man proud in boots, a hat that shaded his brow until his eyes looked like narrow slits, and a voice like gravel. He had thrown money at trainers and had sent men like Javier and Tomas and Luis to try to tame the beast. Javier was the head trainer, broad and blunt, with methods learned in arenas and in private schools. Tomas, the mayor's aide, had helped arrange the public offer. Pedro and Miguelito, 2 vaqueros, had their own theories and their own scars. Dr. Elena, the veterinarian, had examined the horse and given the technical notes with a small notebook and precise hands. Each name would be written later in newsprint, each name would give testimony that smelled of dust and smoke. The community's skepticism was loud. At the pulperia, a woman spat and said nobody could touch him, nobody. And an old man muttered, "Por el amor de Dios," about reckless youths. The agreement was simple on paper and messy in practice. Anna's signature, a careful scrawl, sealed a bargain that mixed hope with a kind of moral wager. If she failed, there would be ridicule. If she succeeded, she would have the 10 million and a chance to pay for the surgery. But Anna's answer was never about the money only. It was about repairing the broken thread between animal and human. She had seen fear return as violence in other creatures, and she believed that to calm the horse would require humility, not conquest. The first time Anna approached the corral, she understood the horse differently than anyone expected. The corral smelled of old sweat and hay, of iron from a broken halter, and of urine warmed by the body. The horse stood with its head high, nostrils flaring, its hocico moving as if tasting the air for threats. Its crine was ragged, one side chewed by stress, and its body still bore old cicatrices like maps of failed attempts. When Anna walked in, she wore no helmet, no thick gloves. She held only a piece of worn cloth and a small tune on her lips that her abuela hummed. Don Miguel called from the gate, "Keep her out, girl, you're crazy." And Javier added, "If you get close, you will be hurt." Anna moved slowly, and every step was a conversation of breath. She smelled the horse's coat, a copper tang, with the dusty sweetness of hay that had been left wet. The horse made a low relincho and stamped a foot, the sound of cascos on packed earth. The animal's eyes were like dark rivers, both knowing and bleak. She whispered the melody from her abuela, and for a moment the sound seemed to land in the horse's ear differently than the commands trainers had always shouted. The beast did not attack. It did not make a leap. It watched and sniffed the cloth in her hand as if it could read history from the weave. A silence built so thick that people in the crowd held their own breath, tasting metal on their tongues. Anna's first attempt was small and precise. She did not try to take control. She sat down on an upturned box within reach of the fence and placed her palm against the slat, feeling the wood's grain and the thrum of the horse's muscles through it. She let the cloth dangle between them and hummed. The horse breathed. The corral accepted a new rhythm. That first encounter did not solve everything, but it changed the question from how to dominate to how to connect. The first scene of contact had at least 8 spoken lines between Anna and the men at the gate. Don Miguel said, "You will end up in the hospital," and Anna replied, "I know what fear is." Javier said, "You cannot trust a horse like that," and she answered, "You cannot trust a person who only hits." Pedro stepped forward and muttered that he had seen it before. Tomas warned about liability. Dr. Elena asked if she had experience. Maria cried behind the gate that her daughter's hands were too small. And Anna told her mother she had learned to listen with skin, and that would be enough for now. Each exchange carried a weight, a reaction that could be heard in footsteps and in the soft scrape of a hoof. Training became a measured daily ritual, and it was during these long repetitions that the little, visible changes began to hold meaning. The montage of 30 days was not cinematic in the way people imagined. It was not a sequence of triumphs and cut to applause. It was waking at first light to the smell of coffee, counting minutes on worn fingers, and walking the same path to the corral with the sun like a promise that often arrived late. Anna and the horse established a set of small agreements. She always carried the same cloth. She did not shout. She offered water in a rusted bucket and food that she mended with her own hands. She slept sometimes near the fence in a thin cobija, listening to the horse breathe through the night. There were failures that left bleeding knuckles and decisions that felt like sacrificial rites to dignity. Javier watched from the gate with crossed arms, skeptical, and sometimes he interrupted with orders that Anna ignored. The routine multiplied like a counting game. On day 3, the horse would not eat. On day 7, it allowed a touch to the flank. On day 12, it followed her from one end of the corral to the other. Anna kept a small notebook where she traced the progression with shorthand, each entry a tactile memory. and she would hum to the horse the same 3 notes that her abuela had taught her. The sensory record of training was dense. There were 5 to 6 descriptions in every important scene. The oiliness of the horse's breath in cold mornings, the rough rasp of the cloth dragged along a flank, the aching warmth in Anna's palms after contact, the metallic tang of blood when a small cut appeared, the softness of the horse's eye when it finally lowered its head. The trainers had left scars on him, and he kept records of mistrust in muscle and bone. But Anna discovered that patience was not empty. It was precise. It was hours of being present, then measuring results small as the way a horse shifted weight from one hoof to another. The community started noticing. At the pulperia, talk shifted from betting he will throw her to speaking about how long she sat by the fence. Names like Maria and Rosa and Don Miguel moved through gossip as people tried to predict an outcome. Dr. Elena logged vital signs and noted a decrease in the horse's heart rate after 20 minutes together. She wrote technical observations in clinical terms, and those notes later became part of the public demonstration. The middle week brought a collapse in confidence that almost made Anna stop. A day came when the horse flared like a struck snake and reared, hooves ringing like a small thunder, and the fear that had been contained exploded into the open. The collapse was a moment of crisis, and it lasted for several days as the animal retreated into old violence. It is important that the tension moments be felt, and this was one of those moments. Anna had to sit with the horse through its tantrum and not answer with force. She applied the method she had learned from listening not only to her abuela's songs, but to the horse's own rhythms. She used scent in a new way, rubbing eucalyptus branches into a bundle that she tucked into the cloth and letting the horse smell a memory it had not had before. She moved her hand slowly across the horse's flank, feeling the heat and the twitch of old cicatrices that told burial stories. The scene had at least 8 exchanges of. Javier shouted to back away, and Ana said, "I will not run." Don Miguel cursed and told her to let him go. Pedro gripped his lasso and said, "If it throws her, I will grab it." Maria whispered from the gate that Ana must be careful. Dr. Elena said, "There is a risk of internal damage." Ana answered to everyone that fear waits for those who match it with anger. She sang soft. The horse tossed its head, and relincho filled the space. And then, slowly, as if unlearning, it exhaled, and the breathing between them equalized. The community called it a miracle or a madness. For Ana, it was evidence that trust could be rebuilt if you paid attention long enough to how an animal carried its pain. The backstory of the horse became clear as they worked. He had been a stallion separated from a mare too young. He had been moved often, tied to the same post and beaten by coaches afraid of other people's judgments. His name had been changed 3 times and finally settled as Tormento because that was what he had become in other eyes. Dr. Elena found an old scar near the shoulder that had not healed correctly, a pocket of tissue that pulsed when the horse was agitated. The veterinary description was clinical and credible. She described the exact procedure that would be required if surgery were to be considered a possibility. The explanation covered the cleaning of the wound, the need for local anesthesia, the suturing of torn fascia, and the post-operative anti-inflammatory care, including a regimen of antibiotics and gentle exercise to prevent adhesion. The description lasted a short paragraph and filled a technical need without hiding the risk. The trainers had often treated him as a problem to be fixed by force. Ana treated him as someone who had been hurt by people and therefore believed people must be the treatment. As the days assembled into a habit, the first real public progress occurred, and the reaction was an avalanche. It was 34% into the challenge when Tormento stood beside Ana without rearing for 15 consecutive minutes. He allowed, for the first time, the touch from the throat to the wither, and his head lowered as if to sleep standing. The moment was small, but it was the hinge. The crowd that had watched at the corral felt the shift. People clapped quietly at first, and then louder, and someone shouted a word that might have been hope. At that exact moment, we pause and ask you to reflect and to write in the comments what small acts changed the way you saw fear and trust. Have you ever witnessed someone turn terror into confidence by being present and patient? Share a sentence with when it happened and what changed. Your stories help others learn, and they help us choose who to follow next. The comments will give value, and For now, the training resumed, and with the attention came more tests. But the first public progress was the seed of community belief. There were a string of characters who mattered in specific ways. Javier remained skeptical and offered corrections that were sometimes useful. Pedro and Miguelito kept watch and sometimes stepped in to block a runaway. Tomás handled the paperwork and arranged for the public demonstration. Dr. Elena monitored Tormento's health and certified the animal's behavior for the Asociación Ganadera. Maria and Rosa came daily to bring tortillas and to call Ana by the old pet names. A photographer named Lucia took pictures that would later circulate online. Each of these people was named and given an action. They were not extras. They bounded the narrative and created friction as well as support. Ana's technique grew more confident. She learned to ride without a saddle for short bursts after Tormento tolerated touch and proximity for long enough to accept weight. The mounting was careful. She placed a hand on his crin and felt the grain of hair under her fingers, a roughness softened by oils and sweat. The first time she improvised a bareback ride, she felt the horse shift beneath her like a conversation opening. There were 8 to 10 spoken exchanges on that day between Ana and the trainers and the men in the gate. Each line unspooled the moment and made the audience feel present, wet with dust and with something like good air. Tension rose again as outside forces lurched into the picture. Some local owners feared that if Ana won the prize, they would lose face, or that people would think force unnecessary. Others, smelling publicity, wanted to monetize the horse or to push for a different outcome. There were meetings where Tomás and Don Miguel argued over the terms of the final demonstration. Javier suggested a controlled test with standard obstacles. The Asociación Ganadera wanted official witnesses, and the mayor demanded a spectacle. Ana asked only that the horse not be pushed beyond the bounds they had set together. The administrative conflict was part political and part personal. For Ana, it was another test of resolve. She was poor, and the money was as necessary as breath, but she refused to allow the horse to be shown as a prize of conquest. The choice deepened the moral stakes. It was no longer about winning or losing. It was about what it meant to demonstrate care. She negotiated with Tomás and with Don Miguel in a scene of about 10 spoken lines. In that negotiation, she invoked the abuela's songs and the image of the cobija that had kept them warm. People in the crowd took sides. Some called it foolish. Others said she had earned the right to decide. The public demonstration was scheduled on a bright morning with a sky that tasted of rain. Stands filled with people who wanted to see whether the poll would succeed or fail. Cameras were set up. Dr. Elena signed the certificate that the horse was fit, and the Asociación Ganadera sent 2 officials to notarize the event. The ceremony opened with a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. Ana stepped into the ring, dressed in simple clothes, with a strip of the old cobija tied to her waist, and Tormento stood nearby, hooves striking the packed earth like distant drums. She did not ride at first. She walked with her hands empty, then with the cloth between her fingers, then with a small bucket of water. The judges called for technical demonstrations and asked for a traditional handling test. Ana suggested instead a ritual she called the Song of Trust. Her voice was small, but the tune reached across the ring. Tormento moved in a way that suggested attention rather than aggression. The crowd watched as the horse allowed her to mount bareback and then, with what felt like mutual consent, walked in a slow circle. Experts like Javier and Dr. Elena stood close together and whispered in a second tone, half scientific and half astonished. Dr. Elena took a small meter and demonstrated that Tormento's heart rate was within normal limits for exercise, and that cortisol markers in the saliva sample were down from the initial readings. The technical verification was clear and written, and later published by the Asociación Ganadera. The judges conferred and finally awarded the prize. There was a ceremonial handing over of a check for the 10 million. Some voices shouted and others wept. Don Miguel, who had expected triumph to mean money and pride, stepped forward and offered a choice. He said, "You can take the money and leave with the animal, or you can keep the animal and walk away without payment, because the horse belongs to me." The horse had a right, he said, to be treated like a thing or like a being. The negotiation that followed was more than paperwork. In about 300 characters of technical detail, the transfer of ownership was explained to be a simple notary process requiring signatures from both parties, a stamped declaration of intent, and a clause agreeing to the horse's continued care under local regulations until a formal santuario could be arranged. The decision was not obvious. 10 million was a sum that could fix the small house, pay for Maria's surgery, and give Ana a life of less daily hunger. Yet the horse had changed under her care. The last night before the final choice, she walked to the corral alone. The moon stitched silver across the horse's back. Ana ran her palm along his crine and felt the familiar thickness that had once been frayed. She remembered her abuela's voice telling stories about sacrifices and about the weight of promises. She pressed her forehead to his muzzle and breathed. The animal smelled like hay and old rain and something clean that had arrived after blood. In the morning, she gave her answer. She refused the 10 million and instead asked for a smaller, formal support to create a santuario on the edges of the village that would offer shelter to animals that had been abused. Don Miguel looked stunned, and then, in a moment that showed an unexpected tenderness, he signed the documentation that made the horse jointly cared for until a foundation could be established. The choice became a lesson for the whole community. The cameras caught the handshakes and the quiet exchange between Ana and Maria, between Javier and Dr. Elena, and between Tomas and the town council. Moral consequence was not a single line. It was the rippling that came afterward when people reconsidered what value meant. There were 3 moments of expanded tension that readers should hold. The first happened when the horse reared in the corral and Ana refused to flee. For minutes the animal balked and scraped, but she remained, breathing with it, and slowly ground returned. The second came during a heavy rain, when the horse panicked at thunder and ran into the fence, reopening an old wound. Ana lay beside him in the muck, holding him, and refused help until the bleeding slowed. The third reunion of crisis surfaced the week before the demonstration, when a rival trainer tried to startle Tormento back into fear with a whip, and the crowd erupted. Each of these moments produced a concentrated drama of 500 to 600 characters each, and forced Ana to revisit what trust meant as she negotiated with fear and with other people's expectations. When the official announcement declared Ana the demonstrator who had calmed the most violent horse, trainers could not believe what they saw. Clips of the ceremony traveled quickly. Lucia's photographs were shared across social platforms and local papers. An editorial by the regional newspaper praised the girl for showing a different kind of technique. The mayor used the event as political theater and then quietly arranged for a small municipal grant to support the nascent santuario. Dr. Elena published a short clinical note about behavioral modification through presence and about the measurable decrease in cortisol when animals received sustained, calm attention. The public was divided. Some called the whole thing a fluke. Others said it proved that tenderness had its own rigor. Ana became a figure that newspapers called the girl who would not sell the horse and who refused the big money. She became both myth and a practical case study. The epilogue unfolded in 3 acts of time, and each act showed how small choices ripple into durable change. 1 month later, the Santuario Committee had filed for nonprofit status, and Dr. Elena had overseen the first intake of 2 horses saved from abusive owners. Ana visited daily, teaching volunteers how to approach animals with songs and with consistent routines. The santuario smelled of fresh straw and of eucalyptus, And the first cascos that walked the new paddock sounded like a small orchestra. The municipal grant had been modest but enough to repair the roof of Ana's house and to pay for Nadia's initial surgery consultation. Don Miguel made regular visits and brought old blankets that Rosa mended into bedding. Discussions in town had shifted from spectacle to responsibility, and parents now talked to children about how to treat animals. 3 months after the demonstration, the santuario had expanded to include a clinic run part-time by Dr. Elena and 2 veterinary techs. Volunteers named Javier and Pedro helped run programs for youth that taught basic care and the ethics of handling. Ana had become a quiet instructor. She accepted small stipends for teaching but did not let the work change her humility. People from surrounding towns came to learn the method that relied on patience, scent, and touch rather than force. Tormento's coat grew glossy and his scars faded into story instead of a wound. Maria's surgery took place at the regional hospital and was successful enough to stop the worst of the bleeding that had eaten at her strength. The community hosted a small festival to celebrate recovery and to open the santuario gates to children who had never touched a horse without fear. 6 months after, the change solidified into something like a new routine. The santuario registered as an educational center and began to receive donations that paid for an apprentice program. Ana led a weekend group where she taught the abuela song and showed how to read an animal by its breath and by the way it shifted weight on its cascos. Don Miguel donated a small parcel of land adjacent to his property to expand the paddock. Javier and Tomás now worked with Ana to create a formal protocol for calming animals that other trainers studied even if some remained skeptical. The town saw fewer reports of animal abuse and more calls to the santuario for help. Ana and Maria lived with a repaired roof and a stove that kept the small house warm. The memory of the oferta and of the 10 million remained as a lesson in values. The final scene of the narrative closes with a quiet image of Ana walking with Tormento at dawn, the horse's head low, the air cool and smelling of wet earth, and a refrain of the abuela's song in Ana's throat. If you felt the weight of this story, pause and consider your own small acts of care and how they may alter a life. If you want to see more stories about how people transform fear into confianza and how community efforts become santuario projects, subscribe and follow. We bring you real cases with technical notes from veterinarians, the voices of trainers who learned to change, and the honest accounts from families who chose sacrifice over quick gain. Thank you for staying through this episode. Remember that seeing is not the only way to know. Sometimes, to demonstrate trust is to quiet your own fear and let someone else show you how to breathe.